You thought he could move product through my city. You can know that's not mine. I watched you. I saw what you did with your own hands. This cocaine came out of your bag. I watched you take something from your pocket and put it in my bag. People always have some story about being set up. Well, not today. My father's district attorney. You're going to prison for this. I saw what you did.
I don't care whose son you think you are, kid. You're just another dealer with some lame excuse. Till my father sees that body cam footage!
The words cut through the September afternoon air like a blade, sharp and unforgiving, carrying with them the weight of authority twisted into something uglier, something that had destroyed lives before and would try again on this particular Tuesday. I don't care whose son you think you are, kid. This cocaine came out of your bag and you're going down for it. You people always have some excuse, some story about being set up. Well, not today. Not on my watch. You're just another punk who thought he could move product through my city. Officer Brendan Castellanos says, his voice dripping with contempt and certainty. You know that's not mine. I watched you. I saw what you did with your own hands. My father is District Attorney Julian Whitmore, and when he sees that body cam footage, and I know you're recording this because it's department policy, you're going to prison for this. I saw what you did, officer. I watched you take something from your pocket and put it in my bag. Darius Whitmore, 17 years old, says, his voice shaking but controlled, fighting through fear as he articulated words that would later save his life. What Officer Brendan Castellanos didn't know as he pressed the cold steel handcuffs against Darius Whitmore's wrists on that unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in late September, as the sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk and witnesses on the halted bus pressed their faces against windows to watch another young black man being arrested, was that his body cam was recording everything, every word spoken in anger and desperation, every movement of his hands as they performed their practiced deception, every second of what would become the most explosive police corruption case the city had witnessed in its 200-year history, and that the terrified teenager in front of him wasn't bluffing about his father, wasn't throwing out a random name in hopes of intimidation, but was telling the absolute truth. But this story, this devastating unraveling of corruption wrapped in a uniform, isn't just about one dirty cop getting caught with his hand in the cookie jar, his prejudice exposed for the world to dissect and condemn. It's about a calculated scheme orchestrated in desperation, about $30,000 in bribe money changing hands in the shadows of public transit, about the precise moment when institutional racism and brazen corruption collided head-on with the wrong family, the wrong teenager, the wrong father who happened to possess both the resources and the righteous fury to burn the entire corrupt system to the ground. Because Officer Brendan Castellanos, in his arrogance and his deep-seated prejudice that made him see criminality in skin color rather than actions, had just planted evidence on the son of the very man who would orchestrate his prosecution, who would stand in a courtroom 6 months later and watch him be sentenced to decades behind bars. This is what happened when a dirty cop's racism made him catastrophically sloppy, when a teenager's hard-won knowledge of his rights and his calm defiance in the face of injustice saved not only his own life but exposed a pattern of corruption that had destroyed 17 other young lives before his, and when a body cam that the officer had foolishly forgotten was rolling became the instrument of accountability that the system had failed to provide for years. If powerful stories, voices, and black triumphs matter to you, subscribe to Bold Black Watch TV. Like, comment, and share so these stories travel further, because every story we tell here shines a light on the moments when justice finally catches up to those who thought they were above it, when accountability meets corruption, and when one family's fight becomes the catalyst for systemic change that benefits us all. Darius Whitmore was 17 years old that September, a senior at Riverside Preparatory Academy where his grade point average hovered at a pristine 4.0, and unlike many teenagers his age who could afford the luxury of recklessness or anonymity, he carried the considerable weight of legacy on his shoulders every single day, wore it like an invisible backpack that grew heavier with each year his father served as the city's district attorney. His father, Julian Whitmore, had been elected district attorney 6 years prior in an election that made history books and newspaper front pages. The first black DA in the county's 150-year history, a barrier-breaking achievement that came with both pride and immense pressure that trickled down to every member of the Whitmore family, especially to Darius, who lived in that imposing shadow but had learned through years of careful navigation to move through the world with grace, dignity, and an acute awareness that his actions reflected not just on himself but on his father's reputation and, by extension, on every black family in the city who saw the Whitmores as representation. That particular Tuesday started like dozens before it, utterly unremarkable in its routine normalcy. Darius was not just a straight-A student but captain of the debate team that had won regional championships 2 years running, headed to Commonwealth State University the following fall on a full academic scholarship worth over $200,000 across 4 years, and he spent his Tuesday and Thursday afternoons volunteering at the Westside Youth Center where he tutored middle school students in mathematics and reading comprehension, giving back to a community that his father served through law and that his mother served through medicine. His mother, Dr. Celeste Whitmore, was a pediatric surgeon at Metropolitan General Hospital, the kind of accomplished black woman who appeared in magazine profiles about having it all, and made it look effortless even though it required Herculean effort. The Whitmores were what sociologists and critics alike called the model minority, the respectable Negroes, the kind of family that made white liberals feel comfortable and made some black folks whisper about assimilation and respectability politics. But Darius didn't invest emotional energy in those debates because he knew exactly who he was. A young man working hard, staying focused, honoring his family's sacrifices, and building a future on the foundation his parents had laid with their blood, sweat, tears, and relentless determination. That Tuesday afternoon, Darius was taking the number 47 Crosstown bus from the Westside Youth Center where he'd just finished a 2-hour tutoring session to his grandmother's house in the Oakmont neighborhood across town, a trip he had made literally dozens of times over the past 3 years without incident, without drama, without anything more eventful than occasionally giving up his seat to elderly passengers or helping mothers with strollers navigate the crowded aisles. His gray Nike backpack, worn from years of use but still functional, contained his silver Lenovo laptop that held all his college application essays and debate research, a 3-ring binder stuffed with advanced placement government notes, 2 textbooks for his dual enrollment college courses, a half-eaten granola bar that he'd forgotten about 3 days ago, a water bottle, and the birthday card he'd carefully selected at Hallmark the previous weekend for his grandmother Loretta's upcoming 75th birthday party that Saturday, a milestone celebration that the entire extended family would attend with all the aunts and uncles and cousins. And the pound cake and sweet potato pie and laughter that defined Whitmore family gatherings. Darius had absolutely no idea, no premonition, no sixth sense warning him, that in less than 20 minutes his entire carefully constructed life would detonate like a bomb, that everything he understood about justice and fairness and the protection that his father's position supposedly afforded him would be tested in the most terrifying way imaginable, that he would find himself handcuffed on a sidewalk, accused of a crime he didn't commit, with planted evidence and a corrupt cop in his own desperate voice shouting truths that would either save him or be dismissed as the lies of yet another young black man that the system had already decided was guilty. Officer Brendan Castellanos was 34 years old that September and had been with the Metropolitan Police Department for 9 years, nearly a decade of service that on paper looked absolutely spotless, even commendable, decorated with citations for drug enforcement busts that had supposedly taken dangerous substances off the streets, community service awards presented by non-profit organizations that feted him as a hero, even a photo opportunity with the mayor during National Police Week, where Castellanos stood in his dress blues looking every inch the dedicated public servant. But beneath that carefully polished surface that gleamed under media lights and passed background checks and impressed promotion boards, Brendan Castellanos was corrupt to his core, rotten from the inside out like fruit that looked perfect until you bit into it and tasted the decay. For 3 years, 3 long years during which he wore his badge and carried his gun and took an oath that he violated daily, Castellanos had been supplementing his $65,000 annual police salary by working as muscle and protection for mid-level drug dealers operating in the city's west and south sides, creating a symbiotic relationship that benefited everyone involved except for the communities being poisoned. His arrangement was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences. He would provide protection to certain dealers by tipping them off about upcoming raids and investigations, would occasionally make arrests of their competition, thereby eliminating business rivals while simultaneously building his reputation as an aggressive drug enforcement officer, and would look the other way when shipments moved through territories he patrolled, and in exchange for these services he received cash payments that over 3 years had accumulated to nearly $215,000 carefully hidden in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands that he'd opened using his cousin's address and a shell corporation that existed only on paper. Castellanos had developed a particular pattern, a signature methodology that he'd refined across 17 separate cases over those 3 years, a system that had worked flawlessly until it catastrophically didn't. He would identify and target young Black and Latino men, usually teenagers or men in their early 20s, individuals who fit a profile that his prejudiced mind associated with criminality despite their actual innocence, and he would plant evidence when needed to build cases that looked absolutely airtight in court. A baggie of cocaine here, a few pills there, sometimes even a weapon if the situation called for it, and then he would testify with the authority of his badge and his uniform and his rehearsed sincerity, and juries would believe him because juries almost always believed police officers over young men of color, and judges would sentence those young men to years in prison, and families would be destroyed and futures would be stolen, and Brendan Castellanos would go home to his townhouse in the suburbs and sleep soundly because he had convinced himself that these young men were probably guilty of something even if they weren't guilty of the specific crimes he'd framed them for, that he was making the city safer even as he made it more corrupt, that the ends justified the means in some twisted utilitarian calculation that let him live with himself. 17 times before that Tuesday in September, Brendan Castellanos had planted evidence on innocent people. 17 families had been destroyed. 17 young men, some still trapped in prison cells, some released but carrying felony convictions that made employment nearly impossible, all of them carrying trauma that would mark them forever, had their lives derailed because a cop decided they looked guilty. And Castellanos had never been caught, had never even been seriously questioned because he was careful in his execution, because he chose his victims deliberately and strategically, calculating that they wouldn't be believed, that they didn't have the resources or the family connections or the social capital to fight back effectively against the machinery of the justice system. But Brendan Castellanos had a fatal weakness that he didn't recognize in himself, a blind spot so massive that it would ultimately destroy him. He believed in his own invincibility with the kind of arrogance that comes from getting away with crimes for so long that consequences seem like abstract concepts that happen to other people. He believed that the badge made him untouchable, that the blue wall of silence would protect him even if questions were raised, that the system was designed to shield officers from accountability even when that accountability was desperately needed. And perhaps most dangerously, he had a prejudice that ran so deep in his psyche, so embedded in his worldview, that it made him reckless in moments when caution was paramount. When Brendan Castellanos looked at a young black teenager, his brain automatically filled in a narrative of guilt and criminality, saw a suspect rather than a student, assumed drugs and violence rather than debate trophies and college applications, and that prejudice, that reflexive, poisonous prejudice, would cost him everything he had. That Tuesday, that specific confluence of prejudice and arrogance and forgotten bodycam technology would transform Brendan Castellanos from a decorated officer into a convicted felon serving decades in federal prison, and he would have no one to blame but himself. The third player in this devastating drama was a man named Leonard Walsh, and at 52 years old he was the kind of person who could disappear into any crowd in America without attracting a second glance. Average height, thinning sandy hair combed over a growing bald spot, wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance, wearing that Tuesday a powder blue polo shirt and pressed khaki pants and sensible walking shoes, looking for all the world like someone slightly boring. Accountant or a middle manager at a regional insurance company or a high school guidance counselor, harmless and forgettable and exactly the kind of unremarkable middle-aged white man that people's eyes slide past without really registering. Leonard Walsh looked harmless. Leonard Walsh was anything but harmless. Walsh was a high-level cocaine distributor who had been successfully moving product throughout the metropolitan area for 15 years without arrest, without serious investigation, protected by his utter ordinariness and his careful operational security and his deliberate cultivation of a boring suburban persona that deflected suspicion. He was smart enough to avoid flashy cars and expensive jewelry and the typical trappings that attracted law enforcement attention, paranoid enough to constantly vary his routes and methods and contacts, and connected enough to have relationships with corrupt officers like Castellanos who could provide advance warning when heat was approaching. That Tuesday, Leonard Walsh was carrying 3 ounces of nearly pure cocaine with a street value of approximately $8,000 hidden in a false-bottom travel bag, heading across town via public transit to meet a buyer in the financial district, planning to complete the transaction and be home in his modest split-level house in the suburbs in time to have dinner with his wife of 26 years who believed he worked in pharmaceutical sales and had no idea her husband was a drug trafficker. But Walsh had a significant problem that Tuesday afternoon that was making his palms sweat and his heart race despite his years of experience in high-stakes situations. He had been tipped off by one of his sources inside the Metropolitan Police Department that officers were running random stop-and-search operations on public transit that day as part of a new initiative to combat drug trafficking, which meant that his usual method of transporting product was suddenly exponentially more dangerous. That every bus stop could potentially be the site of his arrest and the end of his 15-year run of freedom and success. Walsh needed insurance, needed a backup plan, needed something that would protect him if a cop decided to search passengers on that number 47 crosstown bus. And when Leonard Walsh boarded that bus at the West Side Avenue stop and surveyed the interior with the practiced eye of someone constantly calculating risks and angles, when he saw a young black teenager sitting alone 4 rows back, headphones in his ears, backpack beside him on the seat, completely absorbed in whatever he was reading on his laptop and utterly unaware of the predator who had just identified him as an opportunity, Walsh's twisted, racist, criminal mind saw the perfect solution. To his problem, saw someone he could exploit, someone the system would automatically suspect, someone whose life he could destroy without a moment's hesitation or regret, because in Leonard Walsh's worldview that had been shaped by the same poisonous prejudices that infected Brendan Castellanos, young black men were disposable, were convenient scapegoats, were the people who got blamed when white men like him needed to escape consequences. Darius was sitting approximately in the middle of the number 47 crosstown bus, his body angled toward the window where afternoon sunlight streamed in and created patterns on his laptop screen, his headphones delivering the lo-fi hip-hop study playlist that helped him concentrate, completely absorbed in reviewing and editing the personal statement essay for his Commonwealth State University application that was due in 3 weeks, an essay about overcoming adversity and maintaining. Focused despite living in the shadow of achievement, trying to articulate something authentic and compelling about his experience as the son of the city's first black district attorney without sounding privileged or disconnected from the struggles that other black students faced. The bus was about a third full, the typical Tuesday afternoon crowd of service workers heading to evening shifts, elderly folks returning from afternoon errands, a few students with backpacks like his, nothing unusual or noteworthy, just another routine trip across town on public transit. Darius barely noticed when an unremarkable middle-aged white man in khakis and a polo shirt, carrying a small travel bag, boarded at the West Side Avenue stop and after scanning the available seats, chose to sit down 2 rows directly behind where Darius sat. Leonard Walsh spent the next 3 stops, approximately 7 minutes of travel time as the bus made its way through afternoon traffic, carefully observing Darius with the calculating attention of someone planning a crime, studying the teenager's body language and level of awareness, noting that Darius was deeply focused on his laptop screen and completely tuned out from his surroundings in the way that young people with headphones often are, noticing that the gray Nike backpack sitting beside Darius on the seat had a side pocket that was slightly unzipped, perhaps an inch or 2 of opening that would allow access to the interior without needing to fully open the main compartment. Perfect. Absolutely perfect for what Walsh needed to do. At the 4th stop, as passengers shuffled on and off the bus creating momentary chaos and movement that provided cover, Leonard Walsh made his move with the practiced smoothness of someone who had been committing crimes for 15 years without getting caught. He stood up from his seat as if stretching his legs or preparing to exit at the next stop, stumbled slightly forward with the bus's lurching motion as it pulled back into traffic, and in that choreographed moment of apparent clumsiness, his right hand dipped with surgical precision into the slightly open side pocket of Darius's backpack. 3 seconds. Maybe 4 seconds maximum. The small plastic baggie containing 3 ounces of cocaine disappeared from Walsh's palm into the interior pocket of the backpack, buried beneath the birthday card and the water bottle where it would be found by any officer conducting even a cursory search. The entire movement was so smooth, so practiced, so brief, that even passengers sitting nearby didn't notice anything suspicious, just saw a middle-aged man stumbling slightly on a moving bus. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth remembering. Darius felt absolutely nothing, noticed absolutely nothing, remained completely absorbed in the paragraph he was editing about the responsibility he felt to honor his parents' sacrifices and his grandmother's prayers and his community's hopes. His entire focus was on finding the right words to express complex emotions about identity and expectation and aspiration, and he had no idea that his life had just been weaponized without his knowledge or consent, that he was now carrying evidence that could send him to prison, that a predator had just used him as a disposable shield. 2 stops later, at the corner of 5th Street and Morrison Avenue, Leonard Walsh pulled the stop request cord and stood up, gathering his now lighter travel bag and moving toward the front exit with the casual, unhurried pace of someone whose conscience wasn't screaming about the innocent teenager he'd just set up to take his fall. But as Walsh approached the front of the bus, as the doors hissed open and afternoon air rushed in, he saw something that made his calculated criminal mind shift immediately into survival mode. Officer Brendan Castellanos in full uniform, his duty belt heavy with equipment, his Bodycam mounted and presumably activated according to department policy, had just boarded the bus for what appeared to be a routine transit patrol, the kind of random law enforcement presence that the Metropolitan Police Department had been increasing in recent months as part of their public transit safety initiative. Walsh and Castellanos made eye contact for perhaps 2 seconds, And in those 2 seconds an entire criminal transaction was wordlessly negotiated by 2 men who understood corruption intimately. Walsh made a split-second decision born of desperation and enabled by the cash he kept readily available for exactly these kinds of emergencies. He approached Castellanos with the body language of someone asking for directions or assistance, leaned in close so that other passengers couldn't hear the conversation, and spoke in a low, urgent voice that contained both plea and promise. "Officer, I've got 30,000 in cash that says you didn't see me today, and that black kid 4 rows back with the gray backpack is carrying the product you're looking for." Walsh's hand moved with practiced subtlety, transferring a thick envelope from his jacket pocket to Castellanos' palm in a motion that took less than a second. A handshake that wasn't a handshake but a bribe that would change multiple lives. Castellanos felt the weight of the envelope, felt the thickness that suggested substantial cash, and his corrupt brain did its own rapid calculation. $30,000 for what? For arresting a kid who probably was guilty of something anyway? For making a bust that would look good on his record? For taking dangerous drugs off the street even if the specifics of how he found them required some creative interpretation? The prejudice that had guided 17 previous frame jobs activated instantly in Castellanos' mind. Castellanos' eyes followed Walsh's subtle gesture, tracking to where Darius sat absorbed in his laptop, and his brain filled in the familiar narrative. Young black male, wearing a hoodie despite the mild September weather, backpack beside him, probably skipping school or up to no good. Exactly the kind of suspect that Castellanos had built his corrupt career on targeting. His racism made the decision easy. He gave Walsh the slightest nod of acknowledgement, barely a movement, just enough to signal agreement, and Walsh exited the bus at that stop, disappearing into the afternoon pedestrian traffic on 5th and Morrison, vanishing like smoke, free and clear while leaving destruction in his wake. Darius still had no idea his entire life was about to explode, still had no premonition of the terror approaching, was still focused on his essay and his upcoming birthday celebration for his grandmother and his debate tournament next month, completely unaware that a corrupt cop was now approaching his seat with planted evidence in mind and $30,000 in bribe money burning a hole in his pocket. Every story here is bold. Every voice matters. If Bold Black Watch TV moved you, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and help us amplify black stories about justice that deserve to be heard, because what happened next to Darius Whitmore could have happened to any young black person in America, could have destroyed his future completely if not for specific circumstances that most families don't have access to, and that's exactly why these stories matter, why we tell them, why we need you to share them so that awareness becomes action and action becomes change. Brendan Castellanos approached Darius's seat with the confident swagger of a man who had executed this particular performance 17 times before without consequence, his hand resting casually on his duty belt near his handcuffs in a gesture that was both habit and implicit threat. His facial expression already set in that particular configuration of authority mixed with suspicion that cops use when they've decided someone is guilty before any evidence has been examined, his body cam. Recording everything because department policy required all officers to activate their cameras during any public interaction, and Castellanos, despite his corruption, was generally compliant with policies that he believed protected him rather than held him accountable. His voice when he spoke carried the tone of someone issuing an order rather than making a request, someone who expected immediate compliance and would interpret any hesitation as resistance worth documenting. "Afternoon, son. I need you to step off the bus right now for a routine search. Public transit safety protocols. Let's go." Darius looked up from his laptop screen, confusion crossing his face as his brain shifted abruptly from college essays and personal statements to the reality of a police officer standing over him issuing commands, his headphones still in his ears playing music that suddenly seemed jarringly inappropriate for this moment. He pulled the headphones out with his right hand, letting them dangle from his neck, his left hand instinctively moving to close his laptop because that was his reflex. Protect the expensive technology, though in retrospect that small gesture would be analyzed by Castellanos as potentially suspicious, as possibly indicating consciousness of guilt, because cops were trained to interpret any movement through the lens of threat assessment and guilt presumption. "I'm sorry, what did you say, officer? I didn't hear you clearly." "I said random search. Transit safety protocol. Department policy. I need you to gather your belongings and step off the bus immediately. This isn't a request, it's an order." Castellanos' tone had already shifted to something harder, more aggressive, already assuming resistance even though Darius had done nothing but ask for clarification, his prejudice causing him to interpret a polite question as potential defiance. Darius felt that sickeningly familiar tightness in his chest, that terrible combination of fear and awareness that his father had warned him about since he was old enough to understand, That awful knowledge that he was now in a situation where everything he said and did would be scrutinized and interpreted and potentially weaponized against him regardless of his actual innocence or guilt. The conversations his parents had forced him to have, those uncomfortable, necessary, life-saving conversations about how to survive police encounters while black, came flooding back into his consciousness. Don't make sudden movements. Keep your hands visible. Speak clearly and respectfully but assert your rights. Don't consent to searches. Ask for badge numbers. Remember everything because your memory might be the only defense you have. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the adrenaline that was now coursing through his system, trying to remember everything his father had taught him about navigating this exact scenario. Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just riding the bus home from my volunteer work to visit my grandmother. I'm a student at Riverside Prep. I don't understand why I'm being singled out for a search. Darius kept his voice level, kept his hands visible on top of his closed laptop, tried to project calm even though internally he was screaming. I didn't ask for your entire life history or where you volunteer or what fancy school you go to. I said let's go. No. Don't make me ask again. The threat in Castellanos' voice was unmistakable now, the implication that refusal to immediately comply would result in escalation, possibly physical escalation, possibly the kind of violent encounter that Darius's parents had warned him about in those terrible conversations that no black parent wants to have but every black parent must have with their children. The bus driver, a black woman in her mid-50s named Aisha Henderson who had been driving metro routes for 23 years and had witnessed countless interactions between police and young black passengers, countless moments where she wanted to intervene but knew that intervention might make things worse, was watching nervously through her oversized rearview mirror, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly even though the bus was stopped, her own heart rate elevated because she recognized what was happening, had seen it happen before, hated that it was happening again. Other passengers were now paying attention too, some pulling out cell phones to record because this was 2024 and everyone knew that video evidence could mean the difference between justice and injustice, between truth being believed and truth being dismissed as the lies of someone the system had already decided was criminal. Darius stood slowly, deliberately, making sure every movement was visible and unthreatening because sudden movements got black people killed, because reaching for something got black people killed, because existing while black sometimes got black people killed and he wasn't going to give this officer any excuse whatsoever. Okay, I'll cooperate with your request, officer. But I want to be absolutely clear for the record that I'm complying under protest, that I do not consent to any search of my person or my belongings, and that I'm asserting my Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure. I'm cooperating because you're ordering me to, not because I agree that this search is legal or justified. Castellanos' jaw tightened visibly, the muscles in his face betraying his annoyance because this kid knew his rights, was articulating them clearly, was creating a verbal record that could potentially be problematic if reviewed later, and suspects who knew their rights were always more complicated than suspects who could be easily intimidated into compliance. But it didn't fundamentally matter because Castellanos already knew what he was going to find in that backpack, already had the narrative constructed in his mind about how this would play out, already anticipated writing a report that would describe a routine search that uncovered cocaine in a teenager's possession, a clean arrest that would add to his statistics and his reputation. Yeah, you're real smart with those fancy words. You got rights. Great. Now pick up your bag and let's go. We're doing this outside so you're not holding up all these passengers. They exited the bus together, Darius moving carefully down the aisle with his laptop in one hand and his backpack in the other, hyper-aware of Castellanos behind him, of the body cam that was supposedly recording everything, of the passengers watching, of Aisha Henderson's worried expression as he passed her seat. They stepped onto the sidewalk at the corner of 7th Street and Parkview Avenue, a busy commercial intersection with shops and pedestrians and traffic, everything continuing normally as if Darius's world wasn't about to detonate. Castellanos positioned himself strategically with his back partially to his body cam, a move he'd practiced 17 times before, a subtle shift that he believed would obscure the camera's view of his hands, though what he didn't fully understand was that modern bodycam technology used wide-angle lenses specifically designed to capture a broader field of view than traditional cameras, that his positioning wouldn't actually hide what he was about to do from the camera's unblinking eye. Put the bag down on the ground right there and step back 3 feet. Keep your hands where I can see them at all times. Darius complied, setting his backpack down on the concrete sidewalk, taking 3 measured steps backward, raising his hands slightly to chest height with palms open and forward in the universal gesture of, I'm not a threat, please don't hurt me. He was terrified now, properly terrified in a way that felt different from anxiety about tests or college applications, a primal fear that touched something ancient and terrible in the Black American experience. "Officer, may I please know your name and badge number for my own records? I have the right to know who's conducting this search." Martinez. Badge 2847. There. Happy now. Feel safer knowing my badge number? The sarcasm was thick, dismissive, designed to minimize and mock Darius's attempt to assert even basic rights. But Castellanos had just said something that would prove significant later, had just given Darius information to hold on to, a detail that would matter when lawyers got involved and investigations were launched. Darius filed that information away, Castellanos, badge 2847, repeating it silently in his mind because his father had taught him that details mattered, that names and badge numbers mattered, that documentation and specificity mattered when the system tried to protect its own at the expense of justice. What happened next would be analyzed frame by internal affairs investigators, replayed in courtrooms, examined by digital forensics experts, broadcast on national news programs, and viewed over 50 million times across various platforms in the months that followed, becoming a textbook example of police corruption caught on camera and a stark reminder of why bodycam footage matters and why officers who forget they're being recorded sometimes reveal truths they intended to hide. Castellanos opened the main compartment of Darius's backpack first, his hands moving with practiced efficiency through the contents. The Lenovo laptop that clearly wasn't contraband, the 3-ring binder full of AP government notes, the 2 textbooks for dual enrollment college courses, the forgotten granola bar, the water bottle. Nothing interesting. Nothing incriminating. Nothing that would justify this stop. For a split second that the body cam captured perfectly, Castellanos' expression registered confusion mixed with frustration because Walsh had told him the kid was carrying product and so far there was nothing. He moved to the side pockets next, checking the one on the left side first, empty except for a pack of gum and a pen. Then the right side pocket, also empty. Still nothing. Walsh had been specific, gray backpack, black kit for Rose back. This was the right kit. So where was the product? Castellanos' frustration was visible now, his body language shifting to something that would later be described by body language experts who analyzed the footage as agitated and increasingly aggressive. Darius watched carefully, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, his hands still raised, his eyes tracking every movement Castellanos made because something felt wrong about this entire interaction, because his father had taught him that sometimes cops planted evidence and sometimes innocent people got convicted because nobody believed them over uniformed officers. Then Darius saw it. Crystal clear. Unmistakable. The defining moment that would change everything. Castellanos' hand went to his own right uniform pants pocket. Not to the backpack but to his own pocket, and his fingers emerged palming something small and white, something that Darius could see even from 3 feet away was a plastic baggie containing white powder. The movement was quick but not quick enough, practiced but not perfect, confident but caught completely on camera. Then Castellanos' hand dove into the interior pocket of the backpack, the deepest pocket where Walsh had actually hidden the cocaine, and when his hand emerged 2 seconds later it was holding that same plastic baggie in a grip designed to suggest he'd just discovered it rather than planted it. Well, what do we have here? Castellanos' voice carried that tone of false surprise mixed with genuine satisfaction. The voice of someone who'd just found exactly what he'd known he would find because he'd put it there himself. The voice of someone who'd done this 17 times before and never been caught, never been questioned, never faced consequences. Darius's entire world stopped. Time seemed to slow down in that terrible way it does when trauma occurs, when the brain is processing something so catastrophic that normal temporal experience fractures. The fear that had been abstract became concrete and immediate and all-consuming. That's not mine. That is not mine. I just watched you. You took that from your own pocket. I saw you. You palmed something from your own pocket and then pretended to find it in my bag. Sure I did, kid. Sure I did. That's what they all say. Every single one of you has the same story. It's not mine, the cop planted it, I'm being set up. You think you're the first person to try that excuse? Castellanos was already reaching for his handcuffs, already calling for backup on his radio, already writing the narrative in his mind about how this would be documented and reported, confident that his version would be believed because it had always been believed before, because badges carried weight that teenage voices didn't, because the system was designed to protect officers over suspects. No. Darius's voice was louder now, desperate and terrified and fighting for his life in the way that only someone facing false imprisonment can understand. Your body cam. Check your body cam. It recorded everything. It shows you taking something from your pocket. Officer, please check your body cam footage right now. It will show exactly what happened. Castellanos froze for just a moment, literally froze mid-reach for his handcuffs as the words, your body cam, penetrated through his arrogant certainty and touched something closer to real fear. The body cam. His body cam. The camera mounted on his chest that he'd activated at the beginning of his shift per department policy and then completely forgotten about because he'd been wearing body cams for 3 years and had never once faced consequences for anything captured on them, because the footage was rarely reviewed for successful arrests, because the system protected officers and assumed their good faith and gave them every benefit of every doubt. But for just a moment, just a split second, Castellanos felt genuine uncertainty. But then his prejudice reasserted itself, his arrogance returned like a familiar comfortable garment, his racist calculations overrode his momentary doubt. He looked at Darius again, young, black, scared, shouting about being set up, and his brain dismissed the threat because who would believe this teenager over a decorated officer with 9 years of service? Who would even bother checking the body cam footage carefully when the arrest report would document a clean bust? The kid was bluffing, had to be bluffing, was just throwing out anything he could think of to avoid arrest. Turn around right now. Hands behind your back. You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute. You have the right to remain silent. My father is District Attorney Julian Whitmore. Darius shouted it now, loud enough for every witness on the sidewalk to hear, loud enough for Aisha Henderson still sitting in the driver's seat of the stopped bus to hear, loud enough that passers-by stopped and turned and paid attention. My father is DA Julian Whitmore, and when he sees that body cam footage, and I know you're recording because it's department policy, you're going to prison for this. I watched you plant that evidence. The camera saw everything. Castellanos hesitated again, longer this time, because the name Julian Whitmore was not a name you forgot if you worked in law enforcement in this city, was not a name you dismissed casually, was not someone whose son you framed unless you wanted to commit career suicide. Everyone in the Metropolitan Police Department knew Julian Whitmore, the black DA who'd prosecuted 3 corrupt cops in his 6 years in office, who'd reformed the Conviction Review Unit to examine potential wrongful convictions, who'd implemented new policies on police accountability, who didn't play politics when it came to prosecutorial decisions, who'd earned respect even from officers who disagreed with his positions. But Castellanos looked at Darius again, saw a terrified teenager, and his prejudice made the decision for him. The kid was lying. Had to be lying. Was just throwing out a name, hoping it would intimidate, hoping it would work like some kind of magical incantation that would make this go away. I don't care if your father is the governor or the president or Jesus Christ himself. You're under arrest. The cocaine came out of your bag and you're going down for it. Now turn around before I add resisting arrest to your charges. The handcuffs clicked shut around Darius's wrists, cold metal against warm skin, tightened just a bit more than necessary, restraining a 17-year-old honor student who'd never been arrested before, who'd never even gotten a detention, who was supposed to be at his grandmother's house right now delivering a birthday card and instead was being marched to a police cruiser that had just arrived in response to Castellanos' backup request. Darius was crying now, tears streaming down his face not from pain but from fear and fury and the terrible helpless feeling of being accused of something you didn't do and having no power to stop what was happening. Please, he said, his voice breaking. Please just check the footage. Please. I'm telling you the truth. I'm Julian Whitmore's son. Call my father. Please. But Castellanos wasn't listening anymore, was already positioning Darius in the back of the police cruiser, was already thinking about the paperwork he'd need to file, was already confident that this would end like all the others had ended, with his version of events being accepted without question, with another young black man being processed through the system, with another successful drug bust on his record. Aisha Henderson sat in her bus and watched them drive away, and she immediately pulled out her cell phone and started writing down everything she'd witnessed, because she knew that being a witness mattered, that speaking truth mattered, that sometimes the only thing standing between injustice and accountability was someone willing to say, I saw what really happened. What Brendan Castellanos didn't know as he drove toward the precinct with Darius handcuffed and crying in the back seat was that he'd just committed the biggest mistake of his entire corrupt career, had just crossed a line that would destroy him completely, had just planted evidence on the one person whose father had both the resources and the righteous fury and the political capital to burn his entire world to ashes. Bold Black Watch TV is more than a channel, it's a community. Subscribe, like this video, and join us as we celebrate justice, truth, culture, and powerful black narratives. Because what you're witnessing isn't just one family's fight for justice, it's a window into a system that needs to be exposed and reformed, and your engagement with this story, your willingness to share it and discuss it and demand better, that's how change actually happens in America. Darius was transported to the Metropolitan Police Department Central Division Precinct, the main downtown facility where major arrests were processed, where booking rooms had been updated with modern technology and surveillance systems that theoretically increased accountability, and where he was placed in a sterile holding area while Castellanos began the paperwork that would formally charge him with possession of cocaine with intent to distribute, a felony that carried a potential sentence of 5 to 15 years in prison depending on circumstances and prior record. In that holding room, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and walls painted that particular shade of institutional beige that exists nowhere in nature, Darius remained as calm as possible given that his entire life was collapsing around him. But he was insistent in a way that made the processing officers uncomfortable because most 17-year-olds arrested for drug possession were either belligerent or terrified into silence, not articulate and specific about their rights and demands. I want to call my father immediately. I want to speak to my attorney. And I want that body cam footage from Officer Castellanos' camera preserved and secured right now before anyone has the opportunity to delete it or claim it was corrupted or lost. Those are my rights under the Constitution and I'm invoking all of them right now. Darius's voice was steady despite the tears that had dried on his cheeks, despite the handcuff marks on his wrists, despite the terror that he was working very hard to control. The desk sergeant processing his intake was a black officer in his mid-50s named Marcus Williams who'd been with the Metropolitan Police Department for 27 years, who'd seen the department change from the brutal racist organization of the 1990s to something marginally better but still deeply flawed, who'd navigated his own career through discrimination and politics and the constant pressure of being one of the few black faces in leadership positions, and who'd heard rumors over the years about Brendan Castellanos but had never seen concrete evidence of misconduct, never had anything substantial enough to report up the chain of command. Williams paused when he heard the name that Darius kept repeating with increasing urgency and specificity, Julian Whitmore, District Attorney, office number that Darius recited from memory, cell phone number that Darius had memorized since he was 12 years old because his parents had taught him to always know how to reach them in emergencies. Sergeant Williams looked at the intake paperwork that Castellanos had already begun filling out, looked at the teenager in front of him who was too articulate and too specific and too calm to be lying about something this verifiable, looked back at Castellanos who was standing near the booking counter with his arms crossed looking confident and unbothered, and Williams felt something in his gut twist uncomfortably because he'd learned to trust that instinct over 27 years of police work, that feeling when something wasn't right even if you couldn't immediately identify what was wrong. Martinez, what's your body cam status on this arrest? Was your camera activated during the entire interaction? Williams asked, using the name Castellanos had apparently given the kid, his voice carefully neutral but his eyes watchful. My name is Castellanos, not Martinez. And yes, bodycam was active. Standard protocol. Everything was by the book on this one, Sergeant. Clean stop, clean search, clean bust. Kid was carrying 3 ounces of cocaine in his backpack during a routine transit safety sweep. Castellanos' confidence was absolute, his body language projecting certainty and authority. But the kid here says you planted that cocaine, says his father is DA Julian Whitmore, says the body cam will prove he's telling the truth. Those are pretty specific claims. Williams was watching Castellanos carefully now, looking for tells, looking for any sign of discomfort or deception. The kid's lying, Sarge. They all say they're innocent, they all claim they're being set up, they all invoke some important person's name hoping it'll get them special treatment. It's the same script every time. He's just more articulate than usual because he goes to some fancy prep school. Doesn't change the facts. I found cocaine in his possession. Castellanos shrugged dismissively, completely comfortable with his lie because he'd told variations of it 17 times before and had never faced meaningful scrutiny. Then you won't mind if I verify his identity before we process him. If he's lying about being the DA's son, we'll know in 5 minutes. If he's telling the truth. Williams left the sentence unfinished but the implication was clear enough that Castellanos' expression tightened slightly. I'm calling the DA's office right now. That's not necessary, Sergeant. The kid's playing you. He's hoping that invoking some important name will. I said I'm calling. Williams picked up the phone on his desk, his tone leaving no room for argument, his seniority and rank asserting themselves over Castellanos' protests. The next 5 minutes seemed to last hours for Darius, seemed to stretch into infinity as he sat in that holding room hearing Sergeant Williams's voice through the partially open door, hearing him explain the situation to whoever answered at the district attorney's office, hearing him provide details about the arrest and the location and the name Darius Whitmore, hearing him go silent for what felt like an eternity before Williams said, "Yes, sir, he's here, yes, sir, right away, sir," in a tone that suggested someone very important was on the other line giving very specific instructions. Williams hung up the phone and his expression had transformed from cautious concern to something approaching alarm. He turned to Castellanos, and when he spoke his voice carried an edge that suggested the political and professional earthquake that was about to hit. "That was DA Whitmore's office. He's on his way here right now with 2 senior prosecutors and the internal affairs commander. He'll be here in less than 10 minutes because he was already downtown in a meeting." The kid was telling the truth about his father. And if he was telling the truth about that. The color drained from Castellanos' face, visible even under the precinct's harsh fluorescent lighting, as the reality of his catastrophic mistake crashed over him like a wave. Julian Whitmore. Not some random name thrown out in desperation, but the actual district attorney. The man who prosecuted corrupt cops. The man who didn't play politics with justice. The man whose son Castellanos had just framed for felony drug possession. The bodycam footage. The bodycam that was supposedly recording everything. The bodycam that Castellanos had completely forgotten about in his arrogance and prejudice. "Secure that bodycam footage right now," Williams ordered, pointing at Castellanos. "Download it to our secure server, make 3 backup copies, and don't let that camera out of your sight until IA gets here. If that footage gets corrupted or lost or accidentally deleted between now and when the DA arrives, your career is over before the investigation even starts. Do you understand me?" 5 minutes later. 5 minutes during which Castellanos stood frozen in something approaching shock. During which Darius was allowed to wash his face and drink water and call his mother, who nearly had a heart attack when she heard what had happened. During which Sergeant Williams made several more phone calls and began documenting everything with a kind of meticulous attention to detail that suggested he knew this was going to become the biggest case of his career. Julian Whitmore walked through the doors of the Central Division precinct, and the entire energy of the building changed. Julian Whitmore was 47 years old, 6 feet 3 inches tall, 210 pounds of controlled fury wrapped in a tailored charcoal suit, and at that moment he was radiating the kind of barely contained rage that made experienced officers step aside and avoid eye contact. He'd been in a budget meeting with the city council when his executive assistant burst in with a message that his son had been arrested for drug possession, and he'd left immediately, making phone calls from his car that mobilized resources and people and set in motion the legal machinery that would eventually destroy Brendan Castellanos completely. With Julian were 2 of his most senior prosecutors, both of whom specialized in police misconduct cases, and Commander Patricia Reynolds from Internal Affairs, a woman with a reputation for thoroughness that made even clean cops nervous and dirty cops terrified. But Julian's first action wasn't prosecutorial or political or strategic. His first action was pure father. He walked directly to where Darius was waiting in the holding area, and when Darius saw his father, saw the combination of fury and fear and love on his face, he finally broke, finally allowed himself to fall apart in a way he hadn't permitted himself to do in front of Castellanos or Williams or anyone else. "Dad. Dad, he planted it. I watched him plant it. I told him you were the DA and he didn't believe me and he arrested me anyway, and Dad, I was so scared." Darius was crying again, proper crying, the kind of crying that comes from trauma and relief mixing together in a toxic cocktail of emotion. Julian pulled his son into a hug that was probably not procedurally appropriate given the circumstances, but that everyone in the precinct pretended not to notice because even hardened cops understood that this was a father and son before it was a DA and a suspect. "Are you hurt? Did anyone touch you? Did they follow procedure?" "I'm not hurt. Not physically. But Dad, the bodycam. The bodycam caught everything. He took the drugs from his own pocket and planted them in my bag, and I saw it and the camera saw it, and you have to preserve that footage before it disappears." Darius's voice was muffled against his father's shoulder, but every word was clear enough, urgent enough, specific enough that Julian felt his rage crystallize into something colder and more dangerous than simple anger, the determination to see justice done regardless of who it destroyed. Julian turned to Commander Reynolds, who had been his ally on previous police misconduct cases, who he trusted as much as he trusted any officer in a department that still had deep wells of corruption despite reform efforts. "Pat, I want that bodycam footage secured right now. Not in an hour. Not after we fill out forms. Right now. In front of me and multiple witnesses. I want it downloaded, backed up to multiple servers, and I want a chain of custody established that will hold up in federal court, because if what my son is telling me is true, we're looking at deprivation of rights under color of law, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations that are going to federal prosecution. The footage is already being secured, Julian. We're on it. Reynolds was already moving toward where Castellanos stood, looking like a man who just realized he'd walked into a burning building and all the exits had disappeared. The body cam footage was pulled up in a secure conference room 10 minutes later, played on a large monitor in front of an audience that included Julian and Darius Whitmore, Sergeant Williams, Commander Reynolds, Police Chief Harrison, who'd been called from his home and arrived looking both angry and worried about the political implications of what he was about to witness, Brendan Castellanos with his police union representative who'd been called in for protection, and 3 civilians who'd been on the bus and whom Williams had managed to track down through transit authority records, including Aisha Henderson, the bus driver, all of them crammed into a space designed for training meetings rather than life-altering revelations. The video played in complete silence except for the audio from the body cam itself. The quality was better than anyone expected, the wide-angle lens capturing more than Castellanos had calculated, the audio clear enough that every word was audible, every nuance preserved in digital perfection. They watched Castellanos board the bus. Watched him speak briefly with Leonard Walsh, though the audio wasn't clear enough to capture their words. Watched Walsh exit. Watched Castellanos approach Darius. Watched the entire interaction unfold with crystal clarity, Darius's compliance, his clear articulation of his rights, his protest that he hadn't done anything wrong, the exit from the bus, the search of the backpack's main compartment finding nothing, the search of the side pockets finding nothing, and then the crucial moment. The body cam captured it perfectly. Absolutely perfectly. Castellanos' hand going to his own right pants pocket. The palming motion that even without close analysis was obvious to everyone watching. The hand diving into the backpack's interior pocket. The emergence of the plastic baggie. The false surprise in Castellanos' voice. The entire deception laid bare in high-definition video with timestamp and metadata and GPS coordinates all embedded in the file, making it literally impossible to claim this was edited or manipulated or anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. They watched Darius's desperate protests. "That's not mine. I just watched you. You took that from your own pocket." They watched Castellanos' dismissive response. "Sure I did, kid. That's what they all say." They watched Darius invoke his father's name, invoke the body cam footage, beg for someone to check the video. They watched Castellanos ignore every single warning, every single opportunity to stop what he was doing, every single moment where he could have made a different choice. When the video ended, the conference room remained silent for approximately 10 seconds that felt like 10 years. Then Police Chief Harrison, a career officer who'd spent 32 years in law enforcement and had seen terrible things but rarely seen them captured so clearly and undeniably, turned off the monitor and looked at Castellanos with an expression that mixed disgust with something approaching pity. "Officer Castellanos, you are suspended immediately pending criminal investigation. You will surrender your badge, your weapon, and all department equipment right now. You are not to contact any members of this department or any witnesses to this incident. Do you understand?" But Julian Whitmore wasn't finished, wasn't even close to finished, his prosecutorial mind already 3 steps ahead, planning the case he would build and the investigations he would launch and the justice he would pursue with every resource at his disposal. "Before anyone leaves this room, I want to know who else was involved in this. That cocaine came from somewhere. Someone tipped Castellanos off, or someone paid him off, or someone is connected to this, and I want every element of this conspiracy identified and charged. And I want every single case Castellanos has ever worked reviewed immediately, every arrest, every search, every drug bust, every piece of evidence he's ever claimed to have found, because if he did this to my son, if he was this comfortable planting evidence, this isn't the first time." That's when Castellanos broke completely, when the edifice of confidence and arrogance that had sustained him for 3 years of corruption shattered like glass, when he realized that prison was inevitable and the only question was how long he'd serve and whether he'd face additional charges for cases that would now be reviewed. He started talking about Leonard Walsh, about the $30,000 bribe that was still in his locker in an envelope because he hadn't had time to secure it yet, about the setup that Walsh had orchestrated to avoid getting caught with his own product. He tried to spin it as a one-time mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment, a situation where he'd been pressured by a desperate criminal, but even as he talked, his story fell apart under questioning because the offshore bank accounts would be discovered within 48 hours, because the pattern across 17 previous cases would emerge during the comprehensive review, because Leonard Walsh, when arrested, would provide his own testimony and documentation that contradicted Castellanos' attempt to minimize his corruption. Darius sat next to his father throughout this, watching the man who tried to destroy his life crumble and confess and beg for consideration that he didn't deserve and wouldn't receive. And he felt something complicated mixing in his chest, relief that the truth was being believed, rage that this had happened at all, grief for the 17 other young men who hadn't had his advantages and had been destroyed by this same cop, and a kind of terrible clarity about how the system actually worked, and who it protected and why his father's position had been the only thing standing between him and years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. What did this story mean to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like and subscribe to Bold Black Watch TV for more powerful black stories, because Darius Whitmore's story didn't end with that confession, didn't end with Castellanos being arrested and charged, didn't end with the body cam footage going viral. It continued with investigations and trials and 17 families getting phone calls that would change their lives. And we're going to tell you exactly what happened next and exactly what justice looked like when finally came. The investigation that followed Brendan Castellanos' confession and Darius Whitmore's exoneration was swift and comprehensive and absolutely brutal in its thoroughness, the kind of investigation that happens when political will aligns with moral outrage and when a district attorney personally invested in the outcome brings every resource of his office to bear on exposing corruption. Leonard Walsh was identified within 6 hours through traffic camera footage near the bus stop where he'd exited, through Metro Transit Authority records that showed which passengers had used fare card readers at which stations, and through analysis of Castellanos' confession that provided enough details about Walsh's appearance and approximate age and clothing that cross-referencing with databases became relatively straightforward. Walsh was arrested at his modest split-level house in the suburbs at 6:30 the following morning in a raid that involved federal agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration because the case had already been handed over to federal prosecutors who specialized in corruption cases and who could bring charges that carried significantly longer sentences than state-level prosecution would allow. When federal agents searched Walsh's home with a warrant so comprehensive that it allowed them to examine every digital device and every piece of paper and every financial record, they found ledgers documenting 3 years of drug distribution deals worth over $2 million in total transactions, including the specific $30,000 payment to Castellanos that Walsh had meticulously recorded in his encrypted spreadsheets because criminals who survive for 15 years are usually paranoid enough to document everything in case they need leverage or evidence to trade for reduced sentences. Walsh tried to cut a deal immediately, offering to provide information about Castellanos' other corrupt activities, offering to testify against higher-level distributors in his supply chain, offering anything and everything to reduce the federal mandatory minimum sentences he was facing. And federal prosecutors accepted his cooperation because they wanted to build the strongest possible case against Castellanos and because Walsh's testimony and documentation would be crucial in the civil rights cases that were already being prepared. The district attorney's office, with Julian Whitmore voluntarily recusing himself from direct involvement to avoid even the appearance of conflict of interest though everyone knew he was directing strategy from behind the scenes, launched a comprehensive review of every single arrest Brendan Castellanos had made during his 9 years with the Metropolitan Police Department, which amounted to over 300 arrests though most of those were minor infractions and traffic violations that wouldn't have involved evidence planting. The review focused specifically on drug possession arrests where Castellanos had been the arresting officer, where he had conducted searches of persons or vehicles or belongings, where young men of color had been the defendants, and where the suspects had maintained their innocence throughout prosecution and incarceration. The review team consisted of 5 experienced prosecutors, 2 former public defenders who understood how to identify suspicious patterns in arrest reports, a forensic accountant who examined Castellanos' financial records for evidence of payments, and a digital forensics expert who analyzed body cam footage from cases where such footage existed. What they found was devastating and systematic and precisely what Darius Whitmore had suggested when he told his father, "If he did this to me, he did it to others." 17 cases over 3 years where evidence appeared suspicious or inconsistent, where body cam footage either didn't exist because of claimed technical malfunctions or showed questionable search procedures, where young Black and Latino men had been convicted primarily on Castellanos' testimony despite having no prior criminal records and maintaining consistent claims of being set up, where the defendants' families had tried to raise concerns about planted evidence but had been dismissed as making excuses for criminal behavior because who believes a defendant over a decorated officer with commendations and awards and a reputation for aggressive drug enforcement. 17 cases. 17 young men whose ages at the time of arrest ranged from 16 to 24. 17 families who'd watched sons and brothers and cousins be taken away to prison. 7 of those 17 were still incarcerated serving sentences ranging from 3 years to 15 years. 10 had been released after serving portions of their sentences but carried felony convictions that made employment nearly impossible, that disqualified them from student loans and public housing and professional licenses, that marked them permanently as criminals in a society that rarely forgives and never forgets. When the review team's findings were compiled into a 400-page report that detailed each case with forensic precision, when that report was presented to a special grand jury convened specifically to examine police corruption, when the media got wind of the scope of what had been uncovered, the story exploded beyond local news into national headlines. DA's son arrested in planted evidence case, officer caught on body cam, was the initial headline that focused on Darius Whitmore's story, but within 48 hours the narrative shifted dramatically as the full scope emerged. Decorated police officers' 3-year evidence planting scheme exposed, 17 wrongful convictions under review, and systemic police corruption case grows as more victims come forward, and federal prosecutors charge officer with civil rights violations after. Bodycam evidence shows pattern of targeting young black men. 17 families got phone calls that would fundamentally alter their understanding of justice and the system and the years of pain they'd endured believing their sons were guilty when they'd been innocent all along. Those phone calls were made personally by prosecutors from the Conviction Review Unit, careful conversations that began with, "We have reason to believe your son's conviction was the result of police misconduct," and ended with explanations of the legal process for overturning convictions, for expunging records, for potential compensation, though nothing could ever truly compensate for stolen years and destroyed opportunities and trauma that would last lifetimes. Marcus Thompson's mother wept when she received her call, wept so hard that the prosecutor on the phone couldn't continue speaking for several minutes because the sound of a mother's grief mixed with relief was too overwhelming. Marcus had been arrested at 19 for cocaine possession, had maintained his innocence throughout his trial, had tried to tell his public defender that the cop planted the drugs but no one believed him, and had served 4 years of a 7-year sentence before being released on parole 6 months prior to Castellanos' exposure. He was now 23 years old, working at a fast food restaurant because his felony conviction disqualified him from better employment, living in his mother's basement, trying to rebuild a life that had been destroyed by a corrupt cop's prejudice and a system that believed badges over black voices. Jamal Richardson's father had died of a heart attack 2 years into Jamal's 8-year sentence, died believing his son was a criminal, died without ever knowing that Jamal had been telling the truth about being set up. When prosecutors called Jamal's mother with news that his conviction was being vacated, her first response was, "My husband died thinking his son was a drug dealer. He died ashamed. And now you're telling me Jamal was innocent the whole time." The grief in her voice carried an accusation that prosecutors couldn't answer because she was absolutely right. The system had failed her family in ways that couldn't be fixed with legal procedures or financial compensation. The media picked up the story with the kind of intensity that comes from having a perfect narrative that combines corruption, racism, injustice, and dramatic reversal. Cable news shows devoted entire segments to analyzing the body cam footage frame by frame. Legal commentators discussed the implications for police accountability and body cam policy. Civil rights organizations held press conferences demanding systemic reform. The police union initially defended Castellanos with carefully worded statements about due process and presumption of innocence, and not rushing to judgment, but as evidence mounted and additional details emerged about the offshore bank accounts and the pattern of corruption and Leonard Walsh's detailed testimony about the bribery arrangement, even the union went quiet because defending Castellanos became politically impossible when the video evidence was so clear and the number of victims was so large and public opinion had turned so completely against corruption that even union lawyers advised silence. Julian Whitmore's family gave exactly one press conference, scheduled for maximum media coverage on the steps of the criminal justice complex downtown, with Darius standing beside his father looking older than his 17 years, wearing a suit and tie because his mother insisted that appearance mattered even in moments of trauma. His face composed but his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the podium for stability while his father spoke to an audience of reporters and cameras and concerned citizens who'd gathered to witness this unprecedented moment. "My son did everything right that day," Julian said, his voice steady and controlled despite the emotion that everyone could see was barely contained beneath the surface. "He knew his rights because we taught him his rights in conversations that no parent should have to have with their child but that every black parent in America has had at some point. He stayed calm even though he was terrified. He complied with orders even though he protested the injustice. He demanded that the body cam footage be preserved even though he had no power to enforce that demand. And if he had been anyone else's son, if his last name had been different, if he hadn't known to specifically invoke that body cam footage, if his arrest hadn't triggered immediate attention because of my position as district attorney, Officer Castellanos would have gotten away with this. Again. For the 18th time. Julian paused, looking directly into the bank of cameras that would carry this message to millions of viewers across the country, his expression containing the kind of controlled fury that comes from personal experience mixed with professional understanding of systemic injustice. That's the real tragedy here. Not that it happened to my son specifically, though as a father I can tell you that seeing your child in handcuffs and hearing him beg for someone to check the evidence and knowing that he's innocent but powerless is a special kind of hell that I wouldn't wish on anyone. No, the tragedy is that this has been happening to other people's sons for years, that Officer Castellanos successfully destroyed 17 young lives before he made the mistake of targeting someone whose father had resources and credibility and position. The tragedy is that the system protected the officer and dismissed the victims until one victim happened to have the right last name. That ends now. That ends today. We are conducting a complete review of every case Castellanos touched. We are implementing new policies on bodycam review and accountability. We are pursuing federal civil rights charges that will ensure he serves substantial prison time. And we are advocating for the compensation and exoneration of every single person he wrongly accused. Darius didn't speak at the press conference. His parents had decided that protecting his privacy was more important than media exposure, but he stood beside his father as a visual reminder of what was at stake, as a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience, as a 17-year-old kid who'd survived something traumatic and was still processing what it meant. The police union's initial defense of Castellanos crumbled within a week as the evidence became public and as even rank-and-file officers who typically defended their own recognized that Castellanos had crossed lines that couldn't be defended without undermining the entire department's credibility. Internal Affairs opened investigations into 3 other officers who'd worked closely with Castellanos, though those investigations ultimately found no evidence of direct knowledge of the planted evidence scheme even as they raised questions about willful blindness and failures to report suspicious patterns. Darius returned to Riverside Preparatory Academy 2 weeks after his arrest, walking through hallways where everyone knew his story because it had been on national news, where some students looked at him with sympathy and others with the kind of uncomfortable awareness that comes from having privilege exposed and confronted. He'd missed 2 weeks of school, but his teachers gave him extensions on assignments and his debate coach told him his spot on the team was secure and his guidance counselor offered to write a letter to Commonwealth State University explaining the circumstances in case the arrest showed up on background checks even though it had been expunged. But nothing was really the same because Darius had seen behind the curtain, had experienced firsthand how fragile his safety really was, had understood in a way that no classroom lesson could teach that his father's position and his family's status and his own perfect behavior weren't actually shields against a system that saw his skin color before it saw his achievements. He testified before a grand jury, giving detailed testimony about the arrest and Castellanos' actions and the terror he'd felt. He'd been interviewed by Internal Affairs investigators who treated him gently but still made him relive the trauma. He'd seen himself discussed on cable news by pundits he'd never met who analyzed his case as if it were abstract rather than his actual life. His grandmother Loretta's 75th birthday party happened the weekend after the press conference, smaller and quieter than originally planned because the family was still processing trauma and didn't have the emotional energy for a major celebration. But they gathered anyway because family gatherings matter and marking milestones matters, and Loretta insisted that she wouldn't let that corrupt officer steal her birthday joy. The birthday card that Darius had been carrying in his backpack, the one that had been in the bag when Castellanos conducted his search, that had been crumpled and damaged when the bag was emptied during evidence collection, that had been returned to Darius after the charges were dropped, was now wrinkled and torn along one edge, but he gave it to his grandmother anyway because it represented something more than just a Hallmark card, represented his intention and his love and his innocence. "Baby," Loretta said, holding Darius's face in her hands with the kind of gentle firmness that grandmothers perfect over decades, her eyes wet with tears but her voice strong, "Your grandfather, God rest his soul, used to say that sometimes the Lord puts you in the fire not to destroy you but to prove what you're made of, to burn away everything that's not essential and show the world and show yourself what's actually in your core. You've been in the fire, baby, and you didn't melt. You're made of steel, Marcus. Don't you ever forget that." The trials happened 6 months after Darius Whitmore's arrest, 6 months during which federal prosecutors built their cases with meticulous care, during which defense attorneys fought procedural battles and filed motions and tried every legal strategy to minimize their clients' exposure, during which the 17 wrongfully convicted young men were released from prison or had their records expunged and began the painful process of rebuilding lives that had been stolen, and during which Darius himself tried to return to some version of normal teenage existence even though his therapist told his parents that PTSD from the incident would likely affect him for years. Leonard Walsh's trial came first because he'd been offered and accepted a plea deal in exchange for his testimony against Castellanos and for providing documentation about their corrupt arrangement. Federal prosecutors charged him with drug trafficking, bribery of a public official, and conspiracy to deprive individuals of their civil rights, charges that carried combined potential sentences of up to 40 years in federal prison. Walsh's defense attorney argued for leniency based on his cooperation and his lack of prior convictions and his age and health issues, but the federal judge, a black woman named Veronica Martinez who'd spent 20 years on the bench and had no patience for criminals who tried to play the system, was unimpressed by these arguments when weighed against the severity of Walsh's actions and the consequences his choices had caused. "Mr. Walsh," Judge Martinez said during sentencing, her voice carrying the kind of controlled disappointment that somehow felt worse than anger, "you are a 52-year-old man who had every advantage our society offers, who chose to become a drug dealer not out of desperation or lack of options but out of greed and moral bankruptcy. When you realized you might face consequences for your choices, you didn't accept responsibility. You looked around that bus and you saw a black teenager and you decided in that moment that his life was disposable, that you could destroy his future to save yourself, that he was expendable because of the color of his skin. You paid $30,000 to have a child framed for your crime. A child, Mr. Walsh. A 17-year-old honors student with his whole life ahead of him. And you did it without hesitation, without conscience, without any consideration of the devastation you would cause." Walsh's sentencing came down to 18 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole, meaning he would be 70 years old before he was eligible for release, meaning his drug-dealing career was definitively over, meaning he would spend the next 2 decades in facilities designed to house non-violent offenders but which were still prisons with all the degradation and loss of freedom that entailed. His wife filed for divorce before the sentencing even happened. His adult children issued a statement through their attorney disavowing his actions. And his suburban neighbors who'd thought he was a boring pharmaceutical salesman gave interviews to local news expressing shock and disgust that they'd lived next to a drug dealer for 15 years without knowing. But Leonard Walsh's trial and sentencing were merely the opening act, the preliminary event before the main show that everyone was waiting for, the trial of Brendan Castellanos, which had become the most closely watched police corruption case in the city's history and which carried implications that extended far beyond one officer's criminal acts to touch fundamental questions about accountability and racism and the systematic failures that had allowed him to destroy so many lives before he was finally stopped. Castellanos faced trial on 19 separate counts in federal court: evidence tampering, deprivation of rights under color of law, fraud, conspiracy, multiple counts of perjury corresponding to the testimony he'd given in the 17 previous cases that were now known to be based on planted evidence, and civil rights violations that carried enhanced penalties because they were committed by a law enforcement officer under color of authority. The prosecution team consisted of 3 federal attorneys who specialized in public corruption cases plus 2 special prosecutors brought in from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, and they presented a case that was simultaneously straightforward in its central narrative, cop plants evidence on innocent people, and devastatingly complex in its documentation of the systematic nature of Castellanos' crimes across 17 cases over 3 years. The Bodycam footage from Darius Whitmore's arrest played on screens throughout the federal courtroom, projected large enough that every juror could see every detail, could watch Castellanos' hand go to his own pocket, could see the palming motion that even defense attorneys didn't try to explain away because it was so obvious that attempting to deny it would destroy their credibility. The prosecution showed that footage probably 24 times during the trial, from different angles thanks to the Bodycam's wide lens, with different expert witnesses providing commentary about body language and deceptive behavior and the physical impossibility of Castellanos' claim that he'd found the cocaine in Darius's backpack rather than planted it there. But beyond the Bodycam footage that provided undeniable proof of at least one instance of evidence planting, the prosecution presented testimony from 16 of the 17 other victims whose cases Castellanos had corrupted. One victim declined to testify because the trauma was too severe, but the other 16 took the stand one by one and told remarkably similar stories of being targeted, being searched, being accused of possessing drugs they'd never seen, protesting their innocence and being disbelieved, watching their lives be destroyed by a system that believed a badge over their voices. Marcus Thompson testified about his 4-year prison sentence, about losing his college scholarship, about his father treating him with shame and disappointment for years. Jamal Richardson testified about his father dying believing his son was a criminal, about the grief that couldn't be undone even now that his conviction had been vacated. Each testimony built on the previous one, creating an overwhelming pattern of targeting young Black and Latino men, of Castellanos using his authority to destroy lives systematically and with calculation. Leonard Walsh testified for the prosecution as promised in his plea deal, describing in detail how he'd paid Castellanos $30,000 to set up Darius Whitmore, how Castellanos had agreed without hesitation, how Walsh had gotten Castellanos' name and contact information from another dealer who'd used his services before, though that dealer had since been arrested and was cooperating with authorities in exchange for reduced sentences. Financial experts testified about Castellanos' offshore bank accounts that contained $215,000 that could not be explained by his police salary and that corresponded with dates when he'd made major drug busts. Digital forensics experts testified about suspicious patterns in body cam footage from previous cases where cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned or where footage showed questionable search procedures. Darius Whitmore testified on the fourth day of trial, now 18 years old and a freshman at Commonwealth State University, where he'd changed his major from business administration to criminal justice specifically because of what he'd experienced. He sat in the witness box wearing a suit his mother had bought him specifically for this testimony, and he calmly described watching Castellanos plant evidence in his backpack, described invoking his father's name and being dismissed, described the terror of being handcuffed and arrested for something he hadn't done, described the trauma that still woke him up some nights in cold sweats reliving that September afternoon. The defense strategy, such as it was because defending the indefensible is always challenging, attempted to argue that Castellanos was being scapegoated, that he'd made one mistake in judgment with the Whitmore case but that the other 17 cases were legitimate arrests being reopened by a vengeful DA who wanted to make an example of an officer, that Castellanos had been entrapped by Walsh into a momentary lapse that didn't reflect his overall career. But this strategy collapsed under the weight of evidence showing systematic corruption, collapsed when jurors saw that body cam footage for the dozenth time, collapsed when they heard testimony from 17 victims whose stories were too consistent and too detailed to be fabricated. The jury deliberated for 4 hours across one afternoon, and when they returned their verdict, the courtroom was packed with victims and their families, with reporters and cameras, with police officers both supporting and opposed to Castellanos, with civil rights activists and community members who'd been following the case since the beginning. The jury foreman, a middle-aged black woman who worked as a public school principal, read the verdict with a steady voice: guilty on all 19 counts. Not a single acquittal. Complete and total conviction on every charge. Sentencing happened 3 weeks later, enough time for the probation department to complete their pre-sentence investigation and for defense attorneys to prepare their arguments for mercy that everyone knew would be futile given the severity and systematic nature of the crimes. Judge Martinez, the same judge who'd sentenced Walsh, addressed Castellanos directly before imposing sentence, and her words would be quoted in news articles and legal journals and training materials for years afterward. "Officer Castellanos," she began, her voice carrying the weight of both legal authority and moral judgment, "you didn't just break the law. You weaponized your badge and your authority to destroy innocent lives systematically and with calculation. You specifically targeted young men of color because you believed, correctly for years, that the system would believe you over them simply because of your uniform and their skin color. You exploited the racial prejudices that still poison our justice system in order to commit crimes and profit from them while innocent people went to prison. You were right about the system's bias until you made one critical mistake. You targeted Darius Whitmore, whose father had the resources and the credibility and the determination to fight back. That mistake exposed what you'd been doing for 3 years, exposed a pattern of corruption and racism that destroyed 17 young lives and caused immeasurable pain to their families." She paused, looking at the 17 young men sitting in the gallery, most of whom had attended every day of the trial to witness their victimizer being held accountable. These young men, and they were mostly teenagers when you framed them, lost years of their lives because of you. Years they cannot get back. Years of imprisonment, years of carrying felony convictions, years of being treated as criminals by society, years of family members believing they were guilty when they were innocent. Futures were stolen. Dreams were destroyed. And you did it with the calculation and coldness of someone who believed he would never face consequences because the system was designed to protect officers like you over victims like them. Castellanos' sentencing was severe even by federal standards. 23 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, meaning he would be 57 years old at his earliest possible release assuming he earned every day of good time credit available. He would serve that time in a federal correctional institution that housed former law enforcement officers separately from the general population because even in prison there's a hierarchy and cops who betrayed their oath are not popular among any population. As Castellanos was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs and leg restraints that limited his stride to shuffling steps, He looked back once at his wife and adult children sitting in the gallery with expressions of grief and shame, and no one in the courtroom felt any sympathy for him because he'd had 17 opportunities to stop what he was doing, 17 moments when he'd watched innocent young men be convicted and imprisoned and could have chosen differently, and he'd chosen corruption. Every single time until he'd finally been caught. But the story didn't end with Castellanos' conviction and sentencing because criminal justice is only one form of accountability and there was still civil justice to be pursued for the young men whose lives had been destroyed. Darius Whitmore enrolled at Commonwealth State University the following fall exactly as planned, his full 4-year scholarship intact because the university administration recognized that he was a victim rather than a perpetrator and because the publicity around his case had actually made him a somewhat celebrated figure on campus as someone who'd survived injustice and spoken truth to power. He changed his major from business administration to criminal justice with a concentration in wrongful conviction law specifically because of what he'd experienced that September afternoon, because he wanted to become the attorney who defended people who didn't have the protection his father's position had provided, who wanted to be the voice for young black men whose fathers weren't district attorneys, who wanted to work within the system to reform it rather than simply critique it from outside. When a campus newspaper reporter asked him during his freshman year why he'd chosen this path, why he wasn't pursuing a safer career path that wouldn't force him to constantly relive trauma, Darius was characteristically direct and thoughtful in his response. Because I want to defend the people who don't have the protection I had. I want to be the attorney for the kids whose fathers aren't the DA, whose mothers aren't doctors, whose families don't have resources or connections or the social capital that made authorities take my case seriously. I survived because of privilege, not the kind of privilege that means I've never faced racism or injustice, but the specific privilege of having a father whose position meant people listened when I said I was innocent. Most people don't have that, and they deserve defense anyway. The 17 young men whose convictions had been overturned because of Castellanos' exposure filed a class-action civil rights lawsuit against the city, the Metropolitan Police Department, and Brendan Castellanos personally, represented by a coalition of civil rights attorneys including some from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the ACLU who took the case pro bono specifically because of its significance for police accountability. The lawsuit alleged systematic civil rights violations, deliberate indifference by department supervisors who should have caught Castellanos' pattern, failure to properly train and supervise officers, and specific damages including lost wages, pain and suffering, emotional distress, and punitive damages designed to punish the egregious nature of the violations. The city fought the lawsuit initially with city attorneys arguing that Castellanos was a rogue officer whose actions couldn't be attributed to department policy, that his supervisors had no reason to suspect corruption before Darius Whitmore's case exposed it, that individual officers rather than the institution should bear responsibility for their crimes. But these arguments collapsed under the weight of discovery that revealed multiple complaints about Castellanos over the years that had been dismissed without serious investigation, that showed patterns in his arrest statistics that should have raised red flags for any supervisor paying attention, that documented a culture within the department that prioritized arrest statistics and drug bust numbers over careful review of evidence quality or officer conduct. The case settled 18 months after filing for $5 million collectively to be distributed among the 17 victims, an average of approximately $294,000 per person, though actual distributions would vary based on the severity of impact, with those who'd served longer sentences receiving larger shares. It wasn't enough to restore the years lost to imprisonment, wasn't enough to undo trauma or repair destroyed family relationships or resurrect dreams that had died in prison cells, but it was acknowledgement that wrongs had been committed and that compensation was owed even if adequate compensation was impossible. Marcus Thompson used his portion of the settlement to enroll at community college, pursuing the degree that his criminal record had previously made impossible and working toward eventually transferring to a 4-year university. Jamal Richardson used his settlement to start a small business, a detail shop for cars that gave him steady income and autonomy and a fresh start after years of being unhireable because of his felony conviction. Others used their settlements to pay off debts accumulated during incarceration, to move to new cities for fresh starts, to fund therapy and medical treatment for trauma, to support families who'd struggled financially during their imprisonment. Darius Whitmore's individual lawsuit against Castellanos and the city settled separately for $5 million, the largest settlement ever paid in a single planted evidence case in the state's history, a number that reflected both the egregious nature of what had happened to him and his family's resources to pursue litigation aggressively rather than accept early lowball offers. But Julian and Celeste Whitmore made a decision that surprised many observers. They donated the entire $5 million settlement to establish the Justice and Accountability Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal defense for wrongfully accused youth in police misconduct cases, funding which would pay for experienced attorneys and investigators and expert witnesses for families who couldn't otherwise afford them, essentially using their son's trauma to create resources that would help others avoid similar fates or fight back if it happened. The Metropolitan Police Department implemented sweeping reforms in the wake of the Castellanos scandal. Some mandated by the settlement agreement, others adopted voluntarily under pressure from community activists and the city council and the mayor, who recognized that the department's credibility was at its lowest point in decades. Mandatory external body cam audits became policy, with footage from all arrests involving searches being reviewed by civilian contractors specifically looking for irregularities or suspicious patterns. Automatic internal affairs review became required for any arrest where a suspect claimed planted evidence, creating a presumption that such claims deserved investigation rather than automatic dismissal. A civilian oversight board with subpoena power and independent investigative authority was established, composed of community members appointed through a transparent process rather than political cronies who would protect the department. The police union fought these reforms vigorously, arguing they would hamstring officers and make policing impossible and subject good cops to harassment through frivolous complaints. But they lost the political battle because public opinion had turned decisively in favor of accountability after Castellanos' trial, and because even officers who weren't corrupt recognized that the department's reputation needed rehabilitation that would only come through demonstrated commitment to reform. Union leadership eventually acquiesced to the reforms while negotiating for increased liability protections for officers who followed proper procedures, a compromise that gave everyone something while fundamentally changing how misconduct complaints would be handled going forward. Sergeant Marcus Williams, the desk sergeant who'd insisted on verifying Darius's identity that September day rather than simply processing the arrest without question, was promoted to Commander of Internal Affairs 18 months after the incident, his careful attention to detail and his willingness to question suspicious circumstances making him the department's choice to lead reform efforts and rebuild credibility. Williams used his new position to implement early warning systems that would flag officers whose arrest patterns showed statistical anomalies, to create mentorship programs pairing experienced investigators with newer officers specifically to teach ethical policing, and to establish protocols for protecting witnesses who reported misconduct without fear of retaliation from other officers. Aisha Henderson, the bus driver who'd witnessed Castellanos planting evidence and who'd immediately written down everything she saw because she knew that being a witness mattered, testified at all the trials and then quietly retired 2 years later after 25 years of driving metro routes. She occasionally spoke at schools and community centers about the importance of witnessing injustice rather than looking away, about how one person's attention and willingness to document and testify can make the difference between justice and impunity, about her pride in having played a small role in exposing corruption even though it meant reliving traumatic memories through multiple testimonies. Kenneth Walsh, because I realize I've been inconsistently calling him Leonard, from his federal prison cell in Pennsylvania, gave multiple interviews to journalists writing books and documentaries about the case. Interviews where he tried to minimize his role and portray himself as a victim of circumstances rather than an architect of his own destruction. But no one cared about his self-serving revisionism because the evidence was too clear and his culpability was too established. He would be 70 years old before he was eligible for release, and most observers believed he'd die in prison because even with good time credit and model behavior his health was declining, and 18 years was a long sentence for a man already in his 50s. And Brendan Castellanos, badge 2847, formerly a decorated officer, now federal inmate 87,439-112, became a cautionary tale told in police academies across the country, though not always in the way he should have been. Some academies used his case as a tactical warning. Bodycam see everything, technology makes corruption harder, the system isn't as protective as it once was, be careful who you target because you might handcuff the wrong person's son. But other academies, better academies run by instructors committed to ethical policing, used his case as a moral warning. Prejudice and corruption destroy lives. Badges are tools for public service, not weapons for personal profit. The authority we give officers requires responsibility and accountability, and betraying that trust means you're not just a criminal but a criminal who had power and should have known better. Darius knew the real lesson was darker and more complicated than either version, understood in the way that only victims of injustice can understand that he'd been saved by privilege. Not the privilege that meant he'd never faced racism or danger, but the very specific privilege of having a father whose position as district attorney meant people listened when he claimed innocence, meant investigators took his case seriously, meant the system that usually protects officers over accusers made an exception because his last name was Whitmore rather than Thompson or Richardson or any of the 17 other names of young men who'd been just as innocent but hadn't had those resources. On the 2-year anniversary of his arrest, Darius stood at a podium in the state capitol building as a 20-year-old college sophomore who'd just finished his first year of law school because he'd been admitted early through a special program for students with demonstrated commitment to public interest law, testifying before the state legislature about criminal justice reform bills that would implement statewide many of the reforms the Metropolitan Police Department had adopted locally. His voice was steady and clear as he spoke to legislators who would vote on bills affecting millions of lives. 2 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon in September, a police officer tried to destroy my life because he looked at me and saw a criminal instead of a student. He was wrong about me. But the tragedy, the real tragedy that we need to address through legislation rather than just expressing sympathy, isn't that he was wrong about me specifically. The tragedy is that the system believed him 17 times before, when he was wrong about 17 other young men who were just as innocent as I was. And we only know about those 17 cases because he made one crucial mistake. He targeted someone whose father could fight back effectively. Someone whose father had resources and credibility and political capital. Darius paused, looking at the legislators who would vote on these reforms, making eye contact because he'd learned from his debate team experience that eye contact creates connection and connection creates persuasion. The question you have to ask yourselves as you consider these bills isn't, what if that had been my son? Because frankly many of your sons would never be in that situation for reasons that have nothing to do with their behavior and everything to do with their skin color and socioeconomic status. The question is, why did it take it being the district attorney's son before anyone cared? Why were 17 wrongful convictions insufficient to trigger scrutiny? Why do we have a system where the only way to get justice is to have the right last name or the right connections or the right resources? The criminal justice reform bills passed the state legislature 3 months later by comfortable bipartisan margins, with even conservative legislators recognizing that police accountability had become politically necessary in the wake of Castellanos' conviction and the national attention the case had received, though implementation would be complex and resistance from law enforcement lobbies would continue for years. Officer Brendan Castellanos, serving his 23-year sentence in the Federal Correctional Institution in Pennsylvania, would occasionally hear about these reforms through news reports that circulated in prison, would learn that his crimes had triggered policy changes he'd never intended, would perhaps understand on some level that his corruption had ultimately strengthened accountability mechanisms rather than weakening them, though such understanding would provide no comfort during the decades of imprisonment ahead. By his 7th year of incarceration, media interest in his case had faded because new scandals and new injustices had captured attention, because America's collective memory is short and its capacity for sustained outrage is limited, because 23 years is a very long time and most people stopped thinking about Brendan Castellanos long before his sentence was complete. But the families of his victims remembered. The 17 young men whose lives he'd destroyed remembered every day because trauma doesn't disappear with time, it just becomes something you carry differently. Darius Whitmore remembered every time he saw a police officer, every time he got on a bus, every time he packed his backpack for class, remembering in the intrusive thoughts that his therapist told him were normal symptoms of PTSD, remembering in the hypervigilance that made him document and record interactions that most people would consider routine. The body cam that caught Castellanos, the one he'd forgotten was recording, the one that proved every word Darius had spoken was true, was preserved as evidence first and then as a training tool and eventually as a historical artifact that would be shown in law school classes and criminal justice courses as an example of both technology's power to expose corruption and the systematic racism that had allowed that corruption to flourish for years before technology accidentally caught it. 47 seconds of footage from an afternoon in September had been viewed over 50 million times across news reports and documentaries and YouTube videos and social media posts. 47 seconds that exposed 3 years of corruption and freed 17 innocent men and proved that sometimes accountability is possible if the circumstances align correctly and if the victim happens to have the right advantages and if the technology happens to be working and if someone happens to remember to check. Darius's grandmother Loretta had told him at her 75th birthday party that sometimes the fire reveals exactly what you're made of, that trauma either destroys you or proves your strength. And 2 years later Darius understood what she meant in ways that only experience can teach. He'd been through fire. He'd been terrified and powerless and accused and handcuffed and processed through a system designed to presume guilt. But he'd survived. He'd spoken truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. He'd demanded accountability when it would have been safer to accept injustice. He'd used his privilege to fight not just for himself but for others who hadn't had his advantages. Marcus Thompson, Jamal Richardson, and 15 other young men had also been through fire, had been consumed by it for years before Darius's case exposed what had happened to them. And they'd survived too, though their survival looked different because their scars were deeper and their losses were greater and their paths forward were more complicated. But they'd survived. They'd testified. They'd told their truths. They'd watched their victimizer go to prison. They'd received inadequate but meaningful compensation. They'd begun rebuilding lives that had been stolen. Officer Brendan Castellanos had been made of something that looked like steel on the surface but turned out to be rust underneath, corroded by prejudice and corruption and arrogance, collapsing when finally tested by accountability. His life as a free man had ended because he'd believed his badge made him invincible, because his racism had made him reckless, because his corruption had made him sloppy, and because he'd handcuffed the wrong teenager on a Tuesday afternoon in September. The bodycam showed the difference. 47 seconds of high-definition video with timestamp and metadata and GPS coordinates proving that badges don't make you truthful, that authority doesn't make you right, that sometimes the system actually works if you're lucky enough and privileged enough and persistent enough to make it work. Darius Whitmore was made of steel. The 17 young men whose lives Castellanos had destroyed were made of steel even though they'd been broken and reformed in prison's crucible. Brendan Castellanos was made of rust, corroded from within, finally exposed when he forgot the camera was watching. And the body cam, that small piece of technology mounted on a uniform chest, recording silently and indifferently, showed the truth that would have been dismissed without it, proved what needed to be proven, provided the evidence that justice required. 47 seconds that changed everything. If you found this story of justice and accountability powerful, make sure you're subscribed to Bold Black Watch TV because we're bringing you more stories where prejudice meets consequences, where corruption faces accountability, where the voiceless find their voice and the powerless find their power. Hit that like button if you believe bodycam should be mandatory and impossible to turn off without automatic investigation. Drop a comment telling us, should Officer Castellanos' sentence have been longer? Do you think the 17 victims received adequate compensation? What reforms would you implement to prevent this from happening again? Let's discuss in the comments below because these conversations matter, because awareness leads to action, because your engagement with this story helps it reach people who need to see it, helps it travel further into communities where these injustices are still happening, where young men are still being targeted, where corrupt officers are still assuming they'll never face consequences. Subscribe, share, engage. Because justice requires witnesses, accountability requires attention, and change requires all of us refusing to look away from uncomfortable truths about the system we live in and the reforms we need to demand. Bold Black Watch TV is here to tell these stories, to amplify these voices, to celebrate the moments when justice finally prevails even when it takes too long and costs too much. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being part of the community that believes Black stories matter, Black lives matter, Black justice matters. We'll see you in the next story.